Hey everybody, welcome back to another ultimate guide for Path of Exile. This is the ultimate guide to Abyss in patch 3.17 and I'm basically going to tell you all you need to know about this league mechanic. The purpose of this video is to give you a full overview of the Abyss mechanic and basically everything that is surrounding it. The timestamps are in the video, you can check the sections you're interested in. This presentation will be shared in the description in Google Drive. And of course, if you want, you can like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Specifically on the agenda is a short introduction as to what Abyss actually is, then mainly how Abyss works, the rewards and what you can do with them, some tips and tricks at the end, and a conclusion/ending. Alright, let's first start with an introduction. Abyss is a league mechanic that was introduced in the Abyss League in December 2017, so a little bit over 4 years ago. What this does is that you can occasionally, after Act 6, you can find a green dot on the minimap or a crack in the ground, which you can activate by walking on top of it. The crack starts moving, a bunch of monsters spawn, and special loot can drop from whatever the result of the crack is, whether it leads you to an abyssal depth or whether it spawns a treasure chest. The whole idea of this event is that you kill the rare monsters and potentially other monsters within a certain time. There is no timer, but it is definitely a timed event. And if you don't do this, then you will fail the event and the crack closes. Also, you should stay close to it or it simply won't continue. So if you activate it and you start going killing monsters in other parts of the map, this will not really work. Abyss is an interesting mechanic. It has unique loot specifically to this league mechanic, and it's got some unique bosses as well. Most notably are the Abyss Jewels and Stygian Vise. These are items that are often used in build guides, so it's good to understand how you can farm these for yourself if you want to and how these things exactly work. Alright, so I have made a small overview, a small schedule if you will, or a workflow, whatever you want to call this, how Abyss really works. So Abyss actually has quite a few options and I tried to visualize this to make this more clear. So first thing you need to do is enter the map or, enter the zone, because this can also happen in the campaign, but it's mostly useful whenever you are mapping. Now, in most cases, in 92% of all the maps, no Abyss spawns whatsoever, so there's nothing really to worry about. However, in 8% of the time, the Abyss actually spawns. There are a few options. You can fail, because you either run away or you don't kill the monsters in time, or sometimes it gets bugged out, that happens too. So you fail, the Abyss closes, you don't get really anything apart from some experience for killing the monsters. However, assuming you succeed, in roughly 90% of the time, this is my own data, the Abyss leads to an Abyssal Trove, which is a treasure chest that spawns from the ground. You can open it and there will be some Abyss Jewels in there. So this is the loot that you can expect. You can expect to loot 4 different Abyss Jewels. There can be multiple Abyss Jewels in the Trove, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, this all depends on your map modifiers. In 10% of the time, and only if the area is level 70 or higher, so this only happens in mapping, because campaign areas are not this high level. In 10% of the time, you will reach an Abyssal Depth, which is a side area. And in 75% of the time, roughly, you will find a boss, which is called the Stygian Spire. This is just a sort of totem, if you will. You need to kill it, and if you do, you get the same loot as with the Abyssal Trove. However, you also get the Stygian Vise, which is the belt that holds an Abyssal socket, and you can slot one of these jewels into the belt, making this a very powerful item. In 25% of the time, roughly, you will spawn a Lich, which is a much more difficult fight, which we'll get into. I'll give you a small guide and overview of how this works. And this guy not only drops this loot, but also a whole bunch of other unique Abyss items. However, you have options to influence these numbers, especially if you want to focus more on Abyss during your mapping. And that's what we'll talk about right now. So you can improve the odds that an Abyss actually spawns. For example, there are a bunch of minor passive nodes on the Atlas passive tree that give you a plus 1% chance to contain an abyss. There are 9 of these, turning the chance from 8% plus 9% into 17%, simply by taking a bunch of these minor nodes. But there's more. There's also a major node that says areas have 1% chance to contain an abyss per 2% increased pack size. Pack size you can get in all sorts of ways. I am assuming here that you have around 40% pack size, but it could be much more. And 40% pack size will give you a 20% increased chance to spawn an abyss. However, there are more things you can do because scarabs exist, and scarabs are normally really not that easy to find, but in this league they are really shitting out scarabs all over the place as soon as you have unlocked the influenced mapping at tier 14. You will get so many scarabs that this is actually a reasonable option. And if you're in trade, you can buy these things, of course, as well. These scarabs will guarantee you a abyss. If you have the rusted scarab, it gives you just 1. If you have a gilded scarab, it gives you 2. And if you have a winged scarab, these are not that easy to get, but they do exist, they will give you 3 additional abysses. So all of a sudden, assuming you're using a winged abyss scarab, you now have a 3 to 4 abyss spawn chance. You will get 3 for sure because of the scarab, and you have an additional 37% chance to spawn a 4th. There is even more you can do because on the map device there is abyss as well. You can pay 2 chaos before you run your map, and this gives you another 100% chance to spawn an abyss in the zone. So you could end up with 4 to 5 abysses in your map. And we will get to why this could be a very good idea, right? Because this all has to do with the loot, and it also has to do with potentially how many monsters are spawning here. Looking at the other part of the diagram, there are more ways to improve the other odds as well. So we just talked about the abyss spawn rate, which you can crank up to spawning 4 to 5 abysses per map. You can also improve the odds of the actual outcomes once an abyss spawns. So this is the regular flow, right? We have roughly 90% chance to spawn a treasure chest, 10% chance to spawn a depth, and then a 25% chance to spawn a lich, and 75% to spawn a Stygian Spire. However, there is a node on the Atlas passive tree. It's called Awakened Depths. And if you want to find this in the passive tree, you can just type this in the search bar and it will light up. And it says abysses in areas have 50% increased chance to lead to an abyssal depth. You have now a 15% chance to spawn an abyssal depth instead of a 10%, and you have a 50% chance to spawn a lich instead of a 25%. Whether this is good for you depends, of course, but assuming that you're actually willing to kill these liches and go for the good unique loot, then this is a decently interesting node. If there is nothing really for you down here, or you already have your Stygian Vise, which drops from the Stygian Spire, then you can probably spec out of this node because you might be better off with just an Abyssal Trove. But at least you have the option and you know how to influence these odds. However, there is more. This is a little bit of a complicated slide maybe, but I'll walk you through it because you can also improve the loot. So this is a Searching Eye jewel, and this jewel has 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes. That is the standard version of a Searching Eye jewel. However, just like some of the other items in Path of Exile, like your regular equipment, you can make sure that these things don't have just 4 affixes, but many more affixes. Because there is a node once again on the Atlas passive tree, and it says Abyss jewels found in areas have a 20% chance to be corrupted and have 5 or 6 random modifiers. So these, in 20% of the time, it turns a Searching Eye jewel like this one, or a Murderous one, which is the red one, into a corrupted version with 6 affixes. Here you can see 6 affixes. However, the big downside is that these things are corrupted, meaning that you can't craft on these. There's another Atlas passive major node that you can take. It's called Votive Horde. It says Abyssal Troves, those are the treasure chests that spawn out of the ground, in areas have 20% chance to drop a rare item with an Abyssal socket. I have linked one of these items for you here. And you can see one of the affixes is that it has one Abyssal socket, which means that you can slot one of these jewels into this item. This is potentially very powerful because if you don't need all of the sockets on this item, and maybe 3 sockets is enough, then you can use the 4th socket to slot in an additional gem and potentially get, for example, all of this damage right here on your claws. That could be very powerful. What you need to realize though is that this is a suffix like any other suffix, meaning that if you use a Chaos Orb on this item, it's just gonna reroll the entire thing, including this modifier, so that means that the Abyssal socket is gone. That is something to realize. There are 2 more notable Atlas passives on the passive tree that I want to talk about. The first is Abyssal Army. It says Abyss monsters in areas grant 50% increased experience and they spawn 100% increased monsters. I found this node to be very good. It's also quite cheap. It has little investment, only a few points, and it's usually on a path that you're already taking in the tree. It's decent for leveling, that's one of the things. But what some people may not realize, but more monsters is always good. It adds to the quote juice. And whenever someone in a video says juice or juiced maps, it just means that there are a lot of modifiers on the map and a lot of things have been done to the map to increase the quantity, the rarity of the loot, the amount of monsters in the map, and that's what they call juice. And juice is good because typically all other map modifiers apply to additional monsters. So if you have more monsters and you have more quantity and rarity on your map, it just applies to a larger percentage of monsters, meaning that these monsters are basically loot multipliers. This is true in general, by the way, and it is the main reason why juice maps are so good. There's another node that is an interesting one. It's the Lightless Legion. It gives the Abyssal Depth monsters, so only when it spawns the thing underground, a +3 to monster level, 100% more magic monsters, 100% more rare monsters, and 30% increased pack size. You might wonder why this monster level thing is relevant. What it does is that +3 to monster level means that they also drop higher item levels. So a level 83 monster in the tier 16 map gets raised to a level 86 monster, and this monster starts dropping level 86 item level loot. That also includes level 86 item level Abyss jewels. And why would you want these? Well, these can be very important for crafting because some affixes can only be crafted on items that have an item level of 85 or 86. For your average Joe with your average build, this is really not that relevant, but it could be very relevant and valuable for high-end players that want the absolute best crafts, and therefore they need good base items to do that. And this node is going to allow you to create or have these base items drop, and you might be able to sell them for a pretty penny. The other parts of this node is once again more. Alright, more is usually good unless it involves boss damage or something, but otherwise more is good. More magic and rare monsters is simply more loot, and pack size also means more loot. Alright, let's talk about Abyss jewels. There are 4 types of Abyss jewels. You can see the icons over here. There is the Murderous Eye jewel. This is for melee attack characters. There's the Ghastly Eye jewel. This is for summoners. There's the Searching Eye jewel. This is for ranged attack characters. And the Hypnotic Eye jewel, which is for casters. These jewels can be slotted into Abyssal sockets or in the passive skill tree if you want, right? There are jewel slots in the skill tree. One of these jewels also perfectly fits over there. It can have an implicit via harvest. I don't have a picture of that one, but it can have an implicit, and you can use harvest crafting to add an implicit to a Abyss jewel. It can have a synthesis implicit. Now, you don't really need to know what synthesis is. This used to be another League mechanic, but synthesized items still exist, and you can find an example over here. It also says so, right? It's a synthesized Hypnotic Eye jewel, and it has a specific implicit In this case, minions have 5% increased maximum life, which is very decent, and furthermore, you can just craft on this. This is just an item that you can furthermore craft on, not a problem at all. These can be fractured as well. What fracturing does is that it basically locks one of the affixes in place. So that is what you see over here. This is the fractured icon, and you can see it's fractured because it has a different color than the other affixes. And what you can do with this is if you throw, for example, a Chaos Orb on this Searching Eye Jewel, all of the modifiers will change, but not the plus 35 to maximum life. That will be the same, which makes it very powerful, right? This is a guaranteed mod. These Abyss Jewels can be corrupted or double corrupted. So here you can see an example of a corrupted jewel. Now, you can't craft anymore on corrupted items, so that's important to know, but it can give you very powerful implicits. For example, this one gives me a 25% chance to avoid being stunned and increased effect of non-damaging ailments. So that's something like shock, for example. And last but not least, Abyss Jewels can drop from almost any other League mechanic. These things are not exclusive to the Abyss League mechanic. This is the most efficient way to get them, right, with Abyss, but there are other ways too. And these other ways are almost always signified by this little green icon over here. If you do any other League mechanic, whether it's Legion, and this is a Legion incubator, right, or whether it is Delve or Heist or whatever, really, as soon as you see this green icon on a chest or on a monster or on a room in Heist, then you know, oh, this is from the Abyss League, and it can contain Abyss Jewels or fractured Abyss Jewels or synthesized Abyss Jewels. That is what this means. So this is good to realize, and this is true for all League mechanics. They all have each have their like specific icon, if you will. This is the Abyss icon, the green portal, I guess it is. Moving on to the Stygian Vise, this is a great belt for almost any build because it can have the same modifiers as any other belt. Meaning that you can craft triple resistances on this, you can craft life on this, mana, armor, whatever basically belt craft you have, you can put all of that on a Stygian Vise. Plus, it has an implicit which has one abyssal socket, which means that you can put in an abyssal jewel, giving you potentially up to 6 additional affixes, making this overall a very strong item and usually the item of choice unless you have another reason specifically to not use a Stygian Vise. For example, if you want to use a unique belt, then clearly you can't use this one. But in most other cases, people will recommend that you use a Stygian Vise. In order to get one of these, you need to kill the Stygian Spire, which is one of the totem bosses we'll be talking about. They also drop sometimes, quite often in my experience, from the Liches, which are the more difficult bosses in the Abyssal Depth. So this is how you get these items for yourself. They're usually relatively cheap as well on trade. What's good to realize as well is that these can be influenced. This is mostly for high-end crafting, but it is possible to get a Stygian Vise with, for example, Redeemer influence, which is one of the Elder Slayers. And that means that specific modifiers, Redeemer modifiers, can be rolled on the Stygian Vise. You really don't have to worry about that if you have no idea what I'm talking about. It's really not that relevant, but this is for high-end crafting. It's good to realize that this is the case. It can be corrupted, but that's a bad idea because corruption typically adds an implicit or it overrides a current implicit. And if you overwrite the has one abyssal socket implicit, which it is, then then it's kind of defeating the purpose of this item because now you cannot slot an abyss jewel into this thing anymore. Now let's talk a little bit about the uniques, which you can only get from the bosses pretty much. The uniques are very rare, very niche, and really not often used in builds with a few exceptions. I've just listed 2 examples of uniques here, and what they have in common is that they all have an abyssal socket, sometimes 2. That is the overall theme here, but you will see also on trade that these are not commonly used. And because they're not really used that much, but people still drop them because they go into these abyssal depths, they are in low demand and they're pretty cheap most of the time. And in many cases, you will be better off with just a rare item instead of these uniques. They are also a little bit outdated, I feel like. They're now 4 years old, most of these uniques. I don't think they got much of a rework in the meantime. So that is one of the reasons that they're currently a little bit underwhelming. But this might change in the future. So if it does, at least you know how to get these things. Specifically, the Darkness Enthroned, which is a belt, is a popular twink leveling item or an alt leveling item. The reason for that is that you can equip this at level 1 and you can also equip certain Abyss jewels at level 1, giving you, for especially a level 1 character, an awful lot of stats. All of the uniques they can drop from the Abyssal Depth. In some rare cases they drop from the Stygian Spire, which is the totem boss, but in all of the cases they drop from the Lich. These are just 2 examples. I have created a link for you in this presentation to all of the uniques. You can see a complete overview there if you are interested. I want to give you a quick boss guide for the 2 or technically 3 bosses that are in the Abyssal Depth. Most of the time you will face the Stygian Spire. I will put some content in the background right while I'm talking about this. The Stygian Spire is just a totem. And this totem really doesn't do an awful lot. It spawns a bunch of rares from pits across the totem, and what you need to do is just kill the spire. It does not have a whole lot of health, and this is a pretty easy fight. It's kind of hard to fill this fight, to be honest. And like I already mentioned, this Stygian Spire totem drops a Stygian Vise, and that is about it. The Lich, on the other hand, is much more difficult. It's still not extremely difficult. These are still very manageable fights in my opinion, but there are some tactics to this, and I will tell you what you need to do. What happens with the Lich is that at 75%, 50% and 25% health, the Lich disappears into a side area. The Lich first disappears from the main area. He becomes a sort of shadow, and if you look closely, the shadow will move towards a wall, open up a door or a portal right there, and a timer starts. You need to follow the Lich into the side area, kill the Stygian Spire, the totem, again, and then you need to return to the main room and you can continue the fight until you reach the next phase. So you will need to do this 3 times during the fight, and only if you do this then you will complete the fight. If you don't complete this in time, you will fail the fight. It's really not that difficult, once again, because these Stygian Spires don't have a lot of health, but it is good to know that this is the case. You need to follow the Lich into the side areas, kill the Stygian Spires, and go back to the main area and continue working on the Lich. There are 2 Lich bosses available. There is Ulaman, Sovereign of the Well. He attacks with chaos and physical attacks and sometimes disappears to summon a horde of abyssal enemies which you can kill, and if you kill them he returns. And there is Amanamu, Liege of the Lightless. Occasionally he summons stationary Stygian hearts that must be destroyed to make the Lich vulnerable again. Until you destroy these Stygian hearts, he cannot be damaged. These could be somewhat difficult fights, especially if you've never done them before or if you have very little sustain in your build or very little defenses. The Lich can hurt quite a bit, but hopefully with these small and simple instructions you'll be able to kill the Lich and get yourself some juicy loot. Finally, some tips and tricks / a conclusion. What some people may not realize is if you find an Abyss jewel, these things are fairly easy to craft, especially using harvest crafting. I'll be doing this in another video, but in the background you can see me crafting on some of these Abyss jewels. You need to know a little bit what you're doing here, but these are relatively easy to craft and you can craft some really decent Abyss jewels for your build using this mechanic. And finally, what I think is important to realize is that even if you don't need any of the items that Abyss drops, the Abyss still spawns a ton of monsters, and this acts as a loot multiplier in map. Because these Abyss monsters, they can just drop any other loot as well. Chaos orbs, exalted orbs, other useful and valuable uniques, or other stuff that you might need. You're just adding more monsters to the map which is always a good idea. And because of this, Abyss is always a valuable strategy. You can never go wrong getting a few Abyss scarabs into your map device and then just running the map with Abyss active, especially if you invest 2 points in that node that gives you 100% increased monsters and 50% increased XP. That is really, really valuable. I would kind of recommend that to anyone, honestly. It makes the spawns more fun. It makes the event more fun because there are so many monsters coming out of this. And if you can handle it, right, that is of course the prerequisite. But if you can handle it, you should definitely be doing some Abyss. And that is it. That is all I have to say about the Abyss mechanic. I hope you found this guide useful. It took me quite a bit of time to make all of this, as I'm sure you can imagine. So, you know, if you did, please like and subscribe. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching once again. See you soon. Love you all. Bye bye.